Hello and welcome to another modelling video. Today we're going to continue with the airbrush series starting from last week where we had a look at paints, the chemical formulation and how to thin it to an airbrush. Today we're going to be talking about the airbrush and the airbrush setup. If you do wish to take your modelling a little seriously or you do wish to airbrush, this is going to be the biggest investment you'll make in this hobby. And also this is the point in the hobby where things could go wrong if you take the wrong approach. Even though this hobby is subjective, there is a right and wrong when it comes to airbrushing. Let's take a look.
First we'll have a look in input of air. There are various inputs you can get, including a gas canister, a can of air, and air compressors. Air compressors have become quite cheap over time, yet the other alternatives are either not too safe or extremely dangerous. I'm only going to focus on air compressors. This is an example of an air compressor. It's something that's not too overly expensive and it's my second compressor. My first one's in the box on my actual desk, and more or less it's very simple. It more or less sucks in air and holds it. It builds up pressure and it puts it through a very small meeting point, and that pretty much gets your blast of air, basically. Standard, you should get a dial of what pressure, measured in PSI preferably. A water tap. Moisture can get into your air, and when it's compressed, this moisture is no good at mixing paint. Once the water does get in the line and mixes in your paint, you're going to get all sorts of problems with your finish. And a regulator. The regulator controls the flow of air that comes out and more or less your output where you will attach your air hose. Either small or large compressors are fine. A compressor with a tank is most preferable, but it's going to cost a bit. Some are oilless and some do require a little maintenance, so you need to look in the instructions for that. And the more expensive, the better quality of the air, and the less maintenance required and less noise it makes. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but don't cheap out too much because it will come up with problems later on.
Now we've talked about air supplies, the most important part of the airbrush, we're going to have to talk about the main brush itself. And with air supplies you probably can't go too wrong as long as you stick to a compressor and a half decent one. But with an airbrush you can go very wrong. With airbrushing, it's an art within itself, and many forms take place like t-shirt printing or tattoos, freestyle artwork, and of course model kits. You need to do your research before you buy an airbrush, because there are very cheap nasty ones which I will demonstrate in future videos in this series, and ones that are quite difficult to maintain and not too good for a beginner to take on. There's also various types of airbrushes and mechanics behind them. Well, let's have a look at doing some research.
Here I have a basic book on how to do photo retouching with airbrushes. Now this book covers everything that you can do with an airbrush, every possible setup and every possible mixture of paint you can run through it for every application. A book like this is very helpful because it more or less tells you what you need, and it goes through a troubleshooting guide. Another thing you can go for is a modelling magazine. Quite often they'll do a whole spread on airbrushing. I like Fine Scale Modeler, and the March of 2002 has an excellent issue on airbrushing. And more or less for Australia, I've come across this catalogue and a website called runaway13.com. It's a business located in the ACT, more or less Canberra, and they supply an array of very high quality and fairly well priced air compressors and airbrushes. Most of the time these guys go to model conventions. I know they go to Model Expo in Melbourne once a year, so if you buy from them then there you can most likely get a special and save on shipping.
For the rest of the world, more or less you need to find out where's the most convenient place to obtain an airbrush via a website or a hobby store. So investigate your hobby stores, find the brands that are most easily gotten in your country or region, and look on the website, go through forums, whatever, get the model number, name and brand of the airbrush, put it through a search engine and find as many people who use it and how they review it. If you can even email them and contact them and discuss on what they think of the actual airbrush themselves, that will be most helpful.
Now, as I've explained, there are many type of airbrushes, all engineered for different purposes to either be cheap or for high quality purposes. More or less you have three types. A double action, which you can control the airflow through the brush and the amount of paint that's coming out of a nozzle. A single action, you can only control the pressure of air coming out, though the flow of paint has to be pre-adjusted before you start spraying. And a spray gun, more or less it's just like a single action, though it has a larger volume of paint coming out and sort of imitates a spray can. We can see the inside of an airbrush here, or the basic makeup of it. This example of a double action here, you can see the trigger here, that it's able to go backwards with the spring here, and up and down that blocks the air valve here. The blue line here is your airflow. So more or less the compressor feed's going in here and out. You have a needle, that's the most important part of the airbrush, and a paint cup. This is a gravity fed airbrush, and the paint cup is a part of the airbrush. What's different to an gravity fed is an external mix. So for an example of this one, the jar or the bottle connects to the airbrush, and the paint needs to be drawn up by the pressure of air going through the airbrush. So as the air pressure is going in, it's sucking up the paint. Where with this one, the paint is gracefully going in and then being drawn with the air. This is my single action by Citadel. It's more of an air gun than an airbrush because it actually has a wide flow. The difference between an air gun, which we're going to pull apart in an airbrush, is that the needle is actually quite fat, where with the airbrushes the needle's quite small. This is my double action Sparmax. I'm actually a very lazy modeler and I try to paint as much as possible with my air gun to colour in a model, but if I was to do some effects or do some very delicate paint work, I would use this. It's probably not ideal for beginners. The cleaning and maintenance process is a little complex. There's probably far better airbrushes you can buy, like the Runaway.
More or less, in summary, the best I could tell you is research what you're going to buy, what you're most likely going to need. Buy a book on airbrushing and study it extensively. And once you buy your setup, pull apart your airbrush very carefully, bit by bit. Each airbrush will come together with a map of all the pieces, how they go together. When you're doing a full maintenance job on it, you will need to completely strip it. You'll need to clean out clogged paint or dried paint in certain parts, particularly if you made a beginner's mistake. Or you want to flush out all the paints when you're going to put the next week. We will charge all three airbrushes via the compressor. We'll mix some paint and we're going to do a little practice. We'll paint some lines, and the week after that we're going to paint a model and we'll be giving this guy a bit of a go. Thank you for watching, and until next time.